Morning, good morning, good evening, everybody. It's been a crazy day. I had 9 mishalachim outside my office. I went to Daven Mariv. I didn't really have time to prepare, that's not a complaint because, as I said last week, I could speak about Esther, Mordechai, Haman, the Megillah, the laws and hashkafa of Purim from now straight. If we could take a pill that we don't fall asleep from now till Purim, I could speak straight. Not because I'm unique, just because there's so many things about this Yom Tov. So I want to begin with a few statements that I have to make, some housekeeping. First of all, the halachos that I sent out was an error. I sent out halachos for Purim. Obviously, I don't rewrite halachos every year. Halachos are consistent. I do change two things. If it falls out on Shabbos, if there are unique events, due to COVID, we'll change certain halachos. And if I, for some reason, realize I was remiss and I missed something in previous years, I'll add it. For some reason, the halachos that went out this year was related to a Friday, Shabbos, Sunday, Purim. So we'll send out, all the halachos are fine, just when to eat the Suda, Erev Shabbos, you could ignore, we'll send out a correction. The second thing I want to mention is Ukraine. It's a difficult thing to talk about. What am I going to say? That the shir is b'schus all those in Ukraine? I mean, that's certainly true. The schus of the shir, whatever schus it has, we wish that it uplifts the people of Ukraine. It aids the effort in those that are wishing to escape. One of my daughters, plural daughters, teachers from Buffalo, her name was Mara Brachalea. She's a Lubavitcher, and her brother, this is in Buffalo, her brother is the Chabad rabbi in the Ukraine. And he stayed to help people get out. His shul was the shelter, Jew and Gentile alike, offering food and a place to sleep. Unfortunately, when Kiev began to be under attack, he and his family was with him. His family was, till 2 days ago, his family was there. After like 36 hours of traveling, they just escaped. So the shul did send out an appeal from National Council. I would advise everybody to look at other appeals as well. The Aguda has a matching appeal to the rescue efforts of those leaving. In fact, I'll open tonight by stating one of the brachos we make. Now, we're not going to have time, obviously, to get into every aspect of Purim, but one of the more bizarre aspects might relate to Ukraine is the various brachos that are made on the Megillah. So we say, Haraves Rivenu v'Hadonas Dinenu. Now, there's a lot of discussion in the Sfarim. If you actually keep reading, so there are 5 languages. So some say it corresponds to La Yehudim Haisa Ara V'Simcha V'Sasa V'Yikar. So it's corresponding to those. But others suggest much more simply that throughout human history, Jews are always going to be in harm's way. It's just a reality of Golus. And there are 2 ways this could happen. Haraves Rivenu is when Jews are innocent and they're being attacked just because they're caught in the crosshairs. Hadonas Dinenu refers to when Jews are being punished, obviously in a way that is inappropriate, but they're not so innocent. Obviously, right now we're dealing with the first type, Haraves Rivenu. So it's very appropriate for us to begin this year by saying that this year should be in the schus of all those in Ukraine. This is the first time since World War I that Jew is fighting against Jew. There are Jews in the Russian army. There are Jews in the Ukrainian army. If anybody saw the Ami magazine last week, they had these Jewish Ukrainian soldiers with long beards and payas, Ukrainian citizens fighting. And on the other end, on the Russian end, although probably not religious, there are Russian fighters. This is a serious problem in halacha. Not just philosophically that Jews are killing other Jews. Just to move away from Ukraine a little bit, By the founding of the state of Israel, the poskim had to answer questions from Kohanim, who were involved in the War of Independence, who were involved in the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, when they killed in Lebanon, when they killed in various territories. If they're a Kohen, if they're ever allowed to duchen ever again. Rav Yosef, for example, says yes. Reb Abba Shol and Sion says absolutely not. But that's killing non-Jews. Again, the idea of Jew killing Jew is a very famous question in halacha. Baruch Hashem, the past 100 years, we haven't had this issue, and now we have it again. Okay, so with this in mind, let's move forward. Last week, we discussed really one major issue, which is this elementary question that we all know, that Hashem's name is not mentioned in the Megillah. And we spoke about the famous Maharal. That's because Hashem himself was hidden in the story. Then we gave 6 or 7 or 8 other additional answers. And then we mentioned in passing a question that over Shabbos I discussed, and I just want to, for those who weren't there Shabbos, and even for those who were there Shabbos, I want to expand on it. Another question that we asked, which is, what is this term Megillah? We know that Torah, Tanakh, is divided into 3 categories: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. The term Megillah, I have no idea where it comes from. The 5 books that we call the 5 Megillos, nowhere in Gemara, nowhere in the Talmud are these 5 books, Eicha, Rus, Shir Hashirim, Koheles, Esther, are they called Megillah except for Esther. Esther's the only one. And in fact, nobody says on Tisha B'Av what time is Megillah. Nobody says on, I don't know, Sukkot, what time is Megillah. We say what time is Eicha, what time is Koheles, what time is Shir Hashirim, what time is Rus. And we suggested last week, maybe the explanation is based on this idea begun in the mind of Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, who lived in the golden era of the 19th, late 17th, 18th century, who said that Esther means the hiddenness of Hashem, and Megillah comes from the word Gilui, revelation. So Megillah Esther, the revelation of the hidden. But I want to offer tonight 2 reasons, not al pi drush, not pulpity rabbinical stuff, which I say all the time, but I could say now, I don't know how, you can't prove that. It's not algebra. That's why I've never been a fan of drush, because if it's nice, if it feels good in our heart, okay, that's what makes it true. I like things that are evidence-based. So I really worked on this. Like, where did this term Megillah come from for this one book? And I'll give you 2 approaches that I have, and I'll try to be brief again for those that were there Shabbos, Friday night, and Shalosh Shudas when this was discussed. So the first approach comes from a Gemara in the Talmud Yerushalmi. It is not found in the regular Gemara. It's also not found in the Medrash on the Megillah. This is found in the Medrash on, believe it or not, Megillas Rus, or Sefer Rus, I should say. And the Medrash asks a question. It says, what right did Mordechai and Esther have in composing, and the Sanhedrin have in approving a new Yom Tov? You think about Purim, which obviously precedes Hanukkah. Hanukkah was nullified. Why we keep Hanukkah as a question, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yud Ches, page 18, Amud Beis, actually asks, but we're not talking about Hanukkah tonight. What right did they have to invent a new Yom Tov with a special kriya, with special mitzvos, mashalach manos, matanos le'evyonim, etc., etc.? And the Medrash is really bothered by this, because the pasuk in the Torah says that you're not allowed to bal tosef, you can't add to the Torah. So the Medrash answers, it's unbelievable. The Medrash says, ready? Because if you didn't hear me say this on Shabbos, it's really shocking to hear. The Medrash answers and says as follows. Megillas Esther kvar nitnu leMoshe b'Sinai. The story of Purim was given over to Moses at Sinai. Ella, however, ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah. There's no order to the Torah, and that's why it's found at the end. Wow. Now, far from being seen as a metaphorical medrash or an enigmatic medrash, the Mefarshei Megillas Esther, they all ask, based on this medrash, Mordechai and Esther should have known from the very beginning how these events would reach their conclusion. So some suggest that they did know, but for a number of reasons, they kept it a secret. Others suggest that although Moshe Rabbeinu, listen closely to this, because I want to relate it to our opening question. Why is Esther the only book that's officially called a Megillah? So they say that while Moshe was taught and wrote down this story, even though it didn't happen yet, amazingly, it was given over in secret. Mordechai never knew it. If you look at the pasuk in Bishalach, the pasuk states by our first war with Amalek, it says at the end of Bishalach that Hashem says to Moshe that you should write the Sefer Zikaron or Zikaron Basefer, the Simna be'oznei Yoshua, and you should place it in the ears of Joshua. So why both languages? So they suggest that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down all the stories of Amalek. That's the Sefer Zikaron. But when Moshe was then told Simna be'oznei Yoshua to give it over secretly in the ear of Yoshua, that was the story of Purim, and that was kept hidden for many generations. So how does this answer our question? Because the Gemara tells us, as we always mention, the Torah was that we have it today was not given at Har Sinai. As we always say, it couldn't have been. Otherwise, Korach would have read his parsha, the Meraglim would have read his parsha, Moshe would have read Chukas, and certainly not hit the rock after he saw what's going to happen to him. Rather, the oral tradition was given, and the Torah was given later. When was the Torah given? So the Medrash says the Torah was given. Megillos. Throughout the desert, Moshe would go into the Ohel Moed and come out with a scroll. Megillah literally means scroll. And one day he'll come out with Parsha Shatnez, the next day with Shabbos, the next day with Kashrus, and all the parshas we have. Then one day he came out with Bullock. We didn't even know someone was cursing us until he finished the Torah. But based on the Medrash we open with, there was one Megillah that he couldn't attach to the Torah because it was given over secretly, and that was Megillah Esther that the Medrash says was given to Moshe already at Har Sinai, but Moshe couldn't reveal that yet. That was the final Megillah. Again, the Gemara uses the language, the Torah was given Megillah, with scroll by scroll. But the one scroll that we couldn't use or utilize until that it happened was Megillah Esther. And that's why it's called Megillah, because it's the final straw. It's the end of the giving of the Torah. And this explains another Gemara, because the Gemara famously says that when Mashiach comes, we're not going to use any books of Tanakh. The only books we're going to keep are the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, Bereishis Shmos Vayikra Bamidbar Devarim, and Megillah Esther. And everybody wonders, what is Megillah Esther of all the books of Tanakh? Because it was given at Sinai, but it was the last Megillah to be given over to us in the days of Esther and Mordechai, which also explains why Kimu v'Kiblu, why Purim is seen as the Yom Tif that we finally accepted willingly the entirety of the Torah, because it was only then that we were given the entirety of the Torah. Second answer, that's number one. Number two, why is Megillah Esther called Megillah Esther? But by the way, I haven't seen this question really asked, so both of these are my own answers. If you don't like them, you're more than welcome. My second answer, I think, is like this. In the Drush on Shabbos, I spoke about Vayihi Noah. And we spoke about the different tefillos that we don't like to say. Everybody loves when it's a Yom Tif the coming week, because although I have to cook and prepare and clean, at least I don't have to say Vayihi Noam Saturday night. And nobody likes V'hurachu Monday and Thursday. And that's what we talked about. But speaking of Vayihi Noam, it was composed by Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, when did Moshe Rabbeinu compose his 10 to 11 chapters of Tehillim? Remember, Tehillim was composed by 10 different men and women. David HaMelech wrote the majority of it, but there was 10 people together. So the Medrash tells us that when we were subjugated under Paro, Moshe negotiated while still in Egypt that Saturday should be a day of rest. I'm not going to call it Shabbos because it wasn't Shabbos yet. So Saturday was a day of rest. So the Medrash, if you want to look it up, it's in Shemos Rabbah, Perek Hey, note 18. So the Shemos Rabbah then says, okay, what do we do? I mean, there was no Kiddush, there was no Lechem Mishnah, there was no Chalent. So what do we do on our day off? So the Medrash says that there were Megillos. Moshe Rabbeinu, these Kapitelach Tehillim, as Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky often said, that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, he actually wrote it while we were under the thumb of Paro. And on our day off, we would read, the Medrash uses this language, Megillos. We would read these special scrolls that spoke about the fact that Hashem watches over us even in Galus, even when we're in exile, even when we're under the thumb of an authority other than our Torah, we still have hope and we still have the Vekas Pasha. So now it makes sense. The original Megillos were written while in exile. What's the one book in Tanakh that was written in exile? What's the one book in Tanakh that was written in exile, that ended in exile, but yet taught us to have hope, even in exile, in the salvation of Hashem? That's the story of Purim. It began under the thumb, the authority of Achashverosh. It ends under the thumb, the authority of Achashverosh. So if there's one book that represents the Megillos of Mitzrayim, a book that gives us hope in exile, that would be Megillas Esther. Okay, so that's just to finish off what we talked about last week. But now let's move on to some other, what I think, interesting topics. So much to discuss. I wish we could do questions and answers on Purim or on Megillas Esther, because that would be, I have to go in order, because we're not going to be able to get to the Megillah this year.
Rabbi, quick question.
Yes.
Sorry. So the Sifrei Achitzonim that were not accepted that were not canonized, were they also given to Moshe Rabbeinu over this?
No.
No?
So for those who don't understand, there are two types of Sifrei Chitzonim. The Gemara, the Yerushalmi says it refers to Homer, the Odyssey. Believe it or not, the Gemara quotes Homer, and various other Greek works, Plato, Aristotle. But what I think Ira's referring to is a different type of Sifrei Chitzonim, and that's like the Book of Ben Sira. If you're ever in a hotel, I don't recommend this, but let's just pretend you open up the drawer with the Bible. The Gideon Bible typically has the Book of Ben Sira, the book of Susanna, the Book of Judith. These are books that are not in the typical Christian Bible, by the way. This is not a shiur about the Apocrypha, but suffice it to say, what Ira's speaking about is the Gemara does ask that the Book of Ben Sira is a holy book. Why was it not included in the canon? Now, the Book of Susanna is a forgery. I don't want to get into this. But if you do open the Gideon Bible, in what they call the Old Testament, are books the Gemara knew about. Some of them are forgeries and bunk. Some of them are very holy books.
Sefer HaMakkabim, things like that.
Okay, so the Book of Ben Sira is a holy book. The Gemara explains why it's not in there. It was not given to Moshe. This is the only one given to Moshe. I have to say, because you mentioned it, the Book of Maccabees, I don't want to get off on a rant, but a large part of the Book of Maccabees was not written by Jews. The first Book of Maccabees certainly was, perhaps the second book as well. It's not Hanukkah. If you remind me next year, we could give a whole shiur on the writing of the Book of Maccabees, why it wasn't canonized, who wrote it, et cetera, et cetera.
All right.
But let's move on. So let's discuss something lighter. I mean, let's discuss a couple of things quickly. It's already 8:50. Again, if anybody wants to stay on for the next 4 days straight, other than Shabbos, we'll do it. Let's discuss two topics tonight as we're getting closer to discussing the Megillah. The first question I want to discuss tonight is costumes. I think if we're in the midst of preparing for Purim, some of us are very busy with what are we going to dress up as. Now, I have to say, as I have to admit my own averos. My wife always had costumes for the family, and I never put them on. I was too cool for school. Baruch Hashem, I grew up a little bit, and now if there's costumes, I wear them, and I actually enjoy them. The Gemara makes no mention of costumes. Megillah Esther makes no mention of costumes. The Shulchan Aruch makes no mention of costumes. The Rambam makes no mention of costumes. The Medrash makes no mention of costumes. So it's actually interesting. My mind is scrambling what to speak about tonight, but let's start with this. Where do costumes come from? So I'm going to tell you something. I hope it blows your mind. I may have shared it in past years. I don't remember. We never gave a share on Purim before because this type of Wednesday night share is new, but maybe I gave it in different venues. But this is absolutely fascinating. Has anybody here ever heard of and could explain to the audience, you could unmute yourself. Has anybody ever heard of Carnival?
Yes.
So go ahead and tell. I don't want to be the one to do it. Could anybody say what is Carnival?
Isn't that right before Lent in Rio de Janeiro?
It is right before Lent, and it is in Rio de Janeiro. By the way, what overlooks on a mountain Rio de Janeiro?
Oh, that statue.
That statue. It's a very Roman Catholic place. In the 15th century in Vienna, and by the way, they get dressed up. Now, who would ever connect? What other shir? What other rabbi is discussing Carnival in Rio de Janeiro on Purim? Well, they get dressed up. I hate to break it to everybody, but and by the way, when does Lent, to the Chryslers who are speaking now, when does Lent usually fall out?
40 days before Easter.
Which is when?
It's always the month of Adar.
It's always Adar. So now, by the way, what I'm telling you now is absolutely true. We're going to discuss Sfarim in a moment. I don't know if anybody else knows this. So you're going to be in the 99th percentile right now, or the 1 percentile, however you express that. And they wear costumes still. So let me give you the history. The very first mention of getting dressed up on Purim comes from a tshuva from the Shilas for Tshuvas Mahari Mintz. Mahari Mintz discusses, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi Mintz, he died about 1508. He was born in 1405. Just to give you a background who he was, at the age of 62, he left Germany and became the Rav in northern Italy. So can you imagine, in those days, you didn't live over 100 years, but he did. And it's in Italy that he notices for the first time a custom of Jews dressing up in Adar. Now, the reason why this background is important in Rio de Janeiro Carnival is because Carnival comes from Italy. That's where it was born. And exactly what the Chrysler said, due to Lent, which always falls out in Adar. There's a debate in the postgame of who stole from who. Jews, there's a good argument to be made that Jews were tailors, and they would make costumes for the Goyim, for Lent, and for Carnival. And whatever costumes they returned or they didn't sell, we said, you know what, it's Purim time anyway, let's get dressed up. We'll talk about why in a moment. That's one explanation. If that's the explanation, we have a problem. We would not be allowed to dress up. There's a pasuk in the Torah, "Bechukoseihem lo seilechu." We're not allowed to follow in the ways of the Gentiles. So what does that mean? I can't play basketball because basketball was invented by a non-Jewish Canadian. By the way, it was invented in Canada. I hate to break it to everybody. No, "Bechukoseihem lo seilechu" means if there is a custom that has its root in Avodah Zarah, I can't do it. So then how are we allowed to get dressed up? Because we assume, anybody who wears costumes on Purim assume that what's happening in Rio de Janeiro, what started in Italy in the 15th century, actually began with our custom. There was an Italian custom of Jews dressing up on Purim, and the Christians or the Catholics who were preparing for Lent would purchase our costumes when we were done with them, and that's how Carnival started. So that's already amazing. There's no question of the symbiotic relationship between Carnival and Purim. That is information you will get nowhere else. Now, I don't want to spend too long on, oh my gosh, I can't, the time flies too fast. How's already almost 42 minutes?
Rabbi, how does Mardi Gras fit into it? It also starts on Purim.
What's that?
How does Mardi Gras fit in?
It doesn't.
Not at all.
No.
Okay.
I'm sorry, not 42 minutes. I miscalculated. It's only 26 minutes. We have good time. We're doing good. Or it's only, yeah, so we're good with time. So let's assume, which we have to, the Stipler Gaon discusses this, let's assume like we have to. I mean, I shouldn't, by the way, I was very dismissive of Mardi Gras. I don't know. When does Mardi Gras take place?
Also about Lent.
Could be. Could be it
It's
is
the
connected.
Tuesday
I mean,
before Ash Wednesday.
the Jewish, I'm thinking now if I want to go off on a tangent, but let me just say, because you asked, and it does relate to Purim, let me say like this. One of the earliest from communities in the Americas was in New Orleans. Okay. I know nobody does, but I write a book each summer that I send out to the shul on American history. One of my earlier books that I sent out was about this. So one of the students of the Chassam Sofer, can you imagine? Student of the Chassam Sofer, after the Louisiana Purchase, when Jews were finally allowed, I'm going to get way too into history now, but suffice it to say, Jews were very early in Louisiana, especially New Orleans. So I'll just stop there. You could go back at previous emails. You could read my book, and especially the book that's about Rabbi Yisachar Dov Ilovi, who was the rabbi of Shari Chesed in Louisiana, which no longer exists. Right now in New Orleans, there's a little sign that says here existed the first synagogue of the South. So I shouldn't be too dismissive of the Mardi Gras connection. Okay. Whew. Got through that pretty quickly without getting off on too much of a tangent. So let's assume, like we have to, that we in the 15th, 16th century began this custom of costume. So right now we learned two things. The Mardi Gras perhaps, but certainly Carnival comes from us. But where did we get this from? Number two is that we didn't do this till the 15th, 16th century. So in the Maharim Mintz, who died in 1508, he was the first to mention. So why do we do it? So if I would unmute you, which I mean, unmute yourselves, why would you suggest we dress up on Purim? What would you say? Anybody have a suggestion? Nobody?
Esther.
So I think that is the best, or the most. When I don't misunderstand me when I say the most obvious, I mean that in a positive way. The clearest explanation is back to our shir last week. Hashem's not mentioned in the Megillah. What's the famous answer? Not the ones that we gave last week. The one they give to kids. Hashem is hidden, so Hashem's name's not mentioned. Hashem is hidden, so we hide ourselves. There is a concept in the Torah, we're supposed to go in God's ways. So on Purim, we go in God's ways. The question is, are there other reasons that we hide our faces on Purim? So I keep looking at the clock, so let me go through this quickly. Let me give you a few. One is, in the Soloveitchik family, they suggest that if you look at the story of Purim, everybody's dressing up, right? Mordechai puts on a sock. Haman pretends to be Memuchan in the beginning of the story. Vashti makes the women take off their clothes. Esther has to pretend she's not a Jew. Haman has to wear common clothing. Mordechai wears the clothing of the king and put the ring of the king. So there's a lot of manipulation of clothing. That's one approach. Another approach, the Targum. When I say Targum, I don't mean the Art Scroll translation. Targum, Yonasan ben Uziel, for example, existed before the Mishnah. So we're going pretty far back. The Targum says that why did Haman have it out for the Jews? Because Haman was a Malek. He came from Esav. And he thought to himself, a chutzpah, I was supposed to be the chosen person. I was supposed to be the chosen nation. Why am I not the chosen nation? Because Yaakov got dressed up in the clothing of Esav. Hakol kol Yaakov, vayadayim idei Esav. That's what the Targum says. So to demonstrate that what Yaakov did was right, and the Haman could go, as we say in Yiddish, gekak and yam, could go jump in the lake. We get dressed up to demonstrate that what Yaakov did by dressing up was not wrong. That's a pretty amazing answer, because that is the first time in the Torah that we find someone dressing up. I could go on, and if you read the Purim book that I sent out last year, I give about 15 answers as to sources, not my own, as to why we dress up. But just to move on tonight, I want to end this part of the discussion with my favorite answer. Oh, let me say two answers. One is my favorite, but before I get to my favorite, there's one other answer which I like a lot, which is after Beshalach. Does anybody know? This will be very impressive. When was the next time Amalek attacked us? So in the end of Beshalach, we know that story. When was the next time in the Torah Amalek attacked us?
They dressed up as the Canaanim, no?
Ah, you ruined it.
Sorry.
Dr. Stein ruined it. What are you eating, Dr. Stein? It looks good.
Corn on the cob, sorry.
That's, okay, so, well, you didn't, what I wanted someone to say was the Canaanim, but Dr. Stein, who just shut off his video camera because he realized we saw he was eating, Rashi says that it was after Aaron died. So Aaron died, the Ananei HaKavod disappear, and the Canaanim attack us. But Dr. Stein points out that Rashi says it wasn't really the Canaanim. It was Amalek dressed up as the Canaanim. They thought if they would just dress up, Amalek could beat us. So Haman was Amalek. This is the Yom Tov that we fought Amalek and won. So we want to make fun of them. That you think dressing up makes a difference? It means nothing. So we'll dress up as well. Great answer. But I could go on for the next hour giving you many other answers of where this, again, 16th century minhag of dressing up, this minhag of Lent, perhaps Mardi Gras, certainly Carnival, all came from us. But let me give you my favorite answer. Tonight, as I opened up with, it was such a crazy night. I had to be home for something. Then I came here and had literally a line of 9 people or more outside my door. I just made Maariv and I ran home to get a sefer and I came here and I started to share. This is the sefer I got from my house. I wanted to share something with you. I didn't have time to look it up. So someone, Evan, tonight came over to me before Maariv and goes, why was there so many people by you? So he guessed the answer because it's Adar and on Purim you're supposed to give money. So this is true. We'll see how this relates to costumes. Just be patient. Let me get through this paragraph and you'll get the answer. So there is a halacha, a concept. Anybody on Purim who opens their hand for money, you give them. By the way, it's an important thing. You should have money in your pocket. I don't care, even anybody, you give them money on Purim. And by the way, it's also true about tefillah. Just like we give money to anybody, Hashem should give tzedakah for us. Anything that we ask. They say that's why Hashem gave the mitzvah of getting drunk on Purim, which is the next halacha I wanted to discuss, the real secret behind getting drunk on Purim, which you would love, but we're not going to have time tonight. I wish we had time. If you want to stay on, let me know. But anyway, one of the reasons that we get drunk is because the secret of Purim is so profound that anything you daven for will happen, that the Malachim said to Hashem, what are we going to do? The world's going to be out of order. Jews are just going to get whatever they want. So Hashem says, you know what I'll do? I'll give them a mitzvah of Adilo Yada, and they'll never focus on tefillah. They'll focus on spiels. Nothing wrong with spiels. They'll focus on their Shalach Manas theme. Nothing wrong with themes. They'll focus on everything else except for davening. So, so what does this have to do with costumes? It's amazing. Listen to this. So I'm going to abridge several, my own research a few years ago, and this what a sefer wrote and its question, what another sefer wrote and its question. So let me just abridge it all together. If you want notes, sources, I can give it to you another time. So because anybody who's poor could ask for money, and there are people who you don't think are poor that are poor. So how do we protect people to finally be able to ask for money, but not to embarrass themselves? You get dressed up. If there's a mitzvah to get dressed up, nobody has to be embarrassed to ask for money because you don't know who it is. Now, then we had a problem. We had a problem that non-Jews in the shtetl life heard about this, and they would get dressed up and they would come to the rabbi's house, and he sees that he has the RDF book and put out his hand, the rabbi will give him a check. So how do we protect ourselves to make sure it goes only to our brothers and sisters. Nothing wrong with giving money to non-Jews, but on Purim, you have limited funds, want to give it. So that's why we developed this custom. If you ever notice when you deliver shalach manos, especially to a rabbi, but even to a friend, you try to say a Devar Torah about Purim or about the Megillah. You know why? That was a test. So the costume was to hide the embarrassment. The asking for a Devar Torah on Purim more than any other day of the year was to test to make sure they weren't a Gentile. But what's the next problem? What if you have a Jew? So he is Jewish and he is poor, but he doesn't have a yeshiva or she doesn't have a yeshiva education. What do? That's why we made up the idea, the next step of Purim Torah, of ridiculous thoughts on Purim. You know, people say, I don't know if people are familiar with this, Purim Masechtos, and these crazy ideas on that you say on Purim, like Bereshis is gematria of, I don't know, 73, but the world was created, and you make these crazy things up. And that's because, so again, we get dressed up so as the poor shouldn't be embarrassed to ask for money. We ask for Torah to make sure they're Jewish. And if they don't know how to learn, they won't be embarrassed. We'll just think it's funny Purim Torah, that it's not supposed to make sense. Isn't that amazing? And that's the story of us dressing up. Oh boy, it's already 10 after 9. What do I do? Because we're really just getting started. Okay, let me end with a halacha, okay? Before Purim even begins is Taanis Esther. Taanis Esther is not mentioned in the Gemara. It's not mentioned. It is the weakest of all fasts. What I wanted to discuss, my next topic was going to be where the source of Megillah Esther came from, which is very mysterious. But I want to I'll end with this. That relates to what I just said. If you have a Megillah in front of you, you could, and if you have your internet, you could just look it up this way. Turn to Perek Yud, Perek Tes, Pasuk 9, Pasuk Lamed Aleph, so 9:31. So this is an interesting point because this is one of these questions where Taanis Esther came from. The better your answer is, the worse you're off. Because if you have a clear proof for Taanis Esther, then you have to wonder why the Gemara never mentioned it. The Rambam suggests that the source of Taanis Esther comes from 9:31. So this was the moment that we accepted Purim. The pasuk says for holidays for future generations, Divrei Hatzomos v'Zakosam, a time of fasting. Now, if the source of Taanis Esther is that pasuk in the Megillah, then why wouldn't the Gemara mention it? So I want to tell you there are so many theories as to Taanis Esther. Again, it's not mentioned in the Gemara, it's only a custom. The Chafetz Chaim and the Mishnah Berurah brings an opinion. I don't want to go off on a tangent. Let me just tell you the one thing I wanted to share, which I find amazing. The 4 regular fast days, Tzom Gedalia, Asar B'Teves, Shavas B'Tammuz, and Tisha B'Av, Yom Kippur from the Torah. It's a pasuk in Zechariah, and the pasuk says you have to fast, but the pasuk also says you should celebrate. So the Gemara asks, which one is it? Are these days of fasting or are these days of celebration? So the Gemara says it depends. If you're under subjugation, if you're under the thumb of a leader who's punishing Jews, it's a fast day. If we're living in a time of freedom that the Jews and the Sanhedrin is controlling law, then it's a day of celebration. So the Gemara says, what if it's in between, like we have today? So the Gemara says, then it's up to you. So, whoa, that means Shavasa B'Tammuz, the longest fast of the year, is up to us. Maybe we shouldn't fast. Tzom Gedalia is up to us. Why is there halacha in Shulchan Aruch that we have to fast on Tzom Gedalia, Asar B'Teves, Shavas B'Tammuz, and Tisha B'Av? The Gemara says if you're not under the thumb of a dictator and it's not Mashiach, then it's up to you. So where did it come from? So I may have shared this mashal from the Chassam Sofer last week, but it's on this question that he asks, that he makes the mashal. He says, and if someone could unmute themselves, if I said this mashal last week, I don't know if I did or I didn't. Chassam Sofer gives a mashal of I'll say it quickly, there was a prince, and we'll end with this. There was a prince who was banished from the kingdom. He misbehaved. He was warned once, twice, 3 times. He was banished from the kingdom. And the king said, go away. So he had to live on the streets, in the outskirts of the kingdom. He lived with the squalors of society, the low lives of society. And all of his friends, the bums, would say, he's going to forgive you one day. He's going to forgive you one day. He's going to bring you back to the path. Prince says he'll never. They say he has to forgive you. A prince can't live like this on the street. And the prince would steal, rob. He would mug people just to get money so he could eat. One day, like 5 years into his banishment, a caravan arrives, and a guy gets off the caravan, and he opens a scroll and he says, hear ye, the prince shall no longer live in squalor. The king and queen want him to live like a prince. We are going to build you a palace. And you're no longer going to live here on the outskirts of the kingdom on the street, but you're going to live here in a palace with maids and butlers and so on and so forth. And all of his friends started to celebrate, but the prince started to cry. And he said, why are you crying? He said, because until now, I thought my father would bring me home. But now that he's building me a home on the outskirts of the kingdom, now I fear he'll never bring me home. Mordechai and Esther, says the Chassam Sofer, after he gives that parable, they realized the salvation was wonderful, but they realized at that moment, this was the first time that Hashem made it comfortable for us in Golus. Maybe the next temple is not going to be for the long haul. Maybe this is a sign of things to come, that we'll have times in America, we'll have times in South America, we'll have times in Europe that will have a palace. And that's an uncomfortable feeling. The more comfortable Hashem makes it for us, maybe the more permanent he wants us to be here. So Mordechai and Esther said the following: we're going to establish a new day of Yom Tov, but we're going to do something else. Divrei Hatzomot, the fast days of Zechariah that have always been buyer's choice in exile, for now on, they're going to be an obligation. Tzom Gedalia, Sarah B'Teves, Shabbat Tammuz, and Tishbav became an obligation because Mordechai and Esther at that moment decided they're going to be an obligation. Though the fact that we still keep these fast days today, even though based on Zechariah, based on the Pasuk and Nevi'im, it's up to us, is because Mordechai and Esther said there's a sadness. The salvation of Purim represents a sadness that we're going to be in Golus for the long haul. And that's why the Pasuk says Divrei Tzomos, and that's why we fast all those other fasts. And Taanis Esther is representative as the mother of all fasts, because this was the moment on Yud Gimel Adar when the hunted became the hunter and we killed our enemies and we were free, but free in Golus. It was at that moment we realized, oh boy, it may be some time until Mashiach comes. Let's hope that that time has since passed and Mashiach should come in Mehera and the Jews of the Ukraine should be free. Everybody should give at least $100 to the Aguda campaign with the matching funds, or the National Council of Young Israel campaign. It's all going to the same source, just the Aguda has matching funds. With each $100, one person is saved. They're able to, based on the math that I did by the numbers they gave, it seems about it's $100 a person to have the Jewish members of the Ukraine escape. We hope that Zelensky survives and that America is able to do what they can do without starting World War III. And if it is Ikvasa the Mashiach, if it is a time of Mashiach, it should come without any more death. Everybody have a good night, a good week, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.